verse 36 through 40, Gideon and his fleece. So let's read it and then go back and talk a little bit about it. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand as you have said." And it was so. When he rose the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night. And it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. I remember being in 5th grade, hearing this story, and I don't remember what I was going through at the time, but I remember feeling like I needed to ask God to give me some direction, to give me an answer. And so I took a blanket and I put it next to my bed and I prayed over this blanket, because that's what Gideon did. And he asked God, make this fleece or this blanket, make it wet when I wake up in the morning. And I remember waking up the next morning and reaching and touching the fleece and not feeling anything. And I thought, maybe the second day will work. So the next night I put the blanket out. And again, I don't remember what I asked for. I don't even remember what was going on. But I remember waking up and feeling around and feeling, it's dry. Oh, God answered my prayer. I'm feeling the ground. Oh, the ground is dry too. Wait, why didn't that work? And it's funny because that's not exactly the kind of sign that we have to be asking for. Remember, we're not asking for tangible signs like this from Gideon. We have the Holy Spirit to give us these signs. It doesn't mean that God doesn't do signs and wonders and miracles and healings and all of that today. That's not what I'm saying. But to ask God for a sign like this, to test him like this, he has chosen to reveal himself through his Spirit to us today. And so that's what we need to pray for, not necessarily a tangible sign. In Mark 9:23 and 25, there's a father with a sick child. And he brings him to Jesus and he says, "Jesus, can you heal him? Your disciples couldn't do it. If you can, would you please heal him?" And Jesus says, "If you can?" In other words, if I can? What do you mean if I can? Of course I can. For those who believe. And in that moment, the father cries out in a loud voice and says, "I believe. Lord, help my unbelief." And the boy is healed. And there's more detail in that story if you want to read it later. But he says, "I believe, help my unbelief." The unbelief here is something that we all experience. The unbelief that the father was talking about and the unbelief of Gideon right here, it's not showing cowardice. It's showing a little bit of doubt, but it's showing a human doubt, something that we all have and something that God knows we're going to have. And because God knows we're going to have it, he's okay to help us along. And so the unbelief is confusion. It's doubt. It's questioning God. It's blaming God sometimes. It's not understanding how God works. We're not supposed to know how God works. God works on a whole nother level that we don't understand all the time. And so when we're faced with a challenge that pushes against our faith, we might still say that we believe in God, but our human nature doesn't always understand the will of God. And this is the part that we need help with. This is the part that can weaken our faith. And this is what can bring doubt and confusion and blame. And so we need Jesus to help strengthen that part of our unbelief in a difficult, challenging time. And so what Gideon is saying here is, I believe in you, but my faith feels weak and wavering, and I'm begging you to perfect it. So the sign that Gideon asks for is that the fleece would be wet and the ground would be dry. And so we come to verse 38. He rises in the morning, he checks it. Sure enough, God answered this sign, and the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, so much so that he wrings out enough moisture from that fleece to fill up a cup or a bowl. But because Gideon assumes that the fleece might naturally absorb the moisture from around the ground, which might have caused the ground to be dry and the fleece to be so wet, he goes to God a second time and he asks God to give him another sign. And what he says to God in verse 39 is, please don't be mad at me for coming with this request to you again. Because the amount of liquid that he wrung out of that first fleece should have been enough to convince Gideon that God had spoken to him, that God had answered him. But Gideon goes to him a second time. In Genesis 18, verses 32 through 33, we read this story when Abraham is pleading with God to spare the city of Sodom. And he starts with saying, God, if there's 50 righteous men in Sodom, would you not destroy the city? And God says, you know what? Yeah, for 50, I won't destroy the city. Abraham goes to him again and says, for 45, would you not destroy the city for 45? God says, yes, I won't destroy the city for 45. And they go back and forth through these 10, 11 verses where Abraham finally talks God down to 10 righteous people. If there are 10 righteous people, he goes from 50 to 10. And God says, all right, if there's 10 righteous people, I will spare the city of Sodom. And all the while, Abraham is asking for this request. He's saying, don't be angry. Don't be angry. I need to ask you one more time. And so I believe Gideon remembered that story of Abraham. And so he remembers that when you're requesting something of God for the second time, or in Abraham's case, the fifth or sixth time, you come to God humbly and you come and you say, I know you've already given me your word. I know you've already spoken this. I really want to ask you one more time. Would you just reveal it to me once? When you come to God like that, it's got to be with a humble heart. It cannot be with this arrogant, presumptuous heart like God owes you a sign or something and he should owe it to you 5 or 6 times. When God speaks, he speaks. That should be enough. It's the same language from Genesis 18 that we see Gideon using here in verse 39. And so one more test with the fleece, but in the opposite direction. So now Gideon is asking for a dry fleece and wet ground. And let's notice how tender God is in his response to Gideon. God is compassionate to his true believers. Although they might be weak and although they might have flaws like we all do, God stoops down and he scoops up those who are truly, sincerely seeking after him, wanting to know without a shadow of a doubt, what is your will for this situation? In Hebrews 6:17 through 18, we read that God is not opposed to making oaths with his heirs of promise. That's how Hebrews puts it, heirs of promise. God makes oaths. God makes promises. God gives signs and wonders to confirm in the hearts of his people that he is, number one, a God who does not lie, and number two, a God who is unchangeable and who gives hope. The signs that Gideon was asking for and the response that Gideon received from God was first miraculous. This happened on 2 back-to-back nights with 2 opposite results. Wet fleece, dry ground, dry fleece, wet ground. This happens not by chance. God doesn't do anything by chance. There is nothing coincidental about God. This is by design to confirm in Gideon's heart that God is truly calling him to be Israel's deliverer. The signs were also significant. Gideon and his men were going up against a massive group of people. The Israelites seemed insignificant, such as that small fleece on the vast desert floor. And yet God saw the fleece. God responded to Gideon's request for a sign. He uses the fleece for his purpose, and he's about to use Gideon for his glory.